one thing that to point out is that one of the great things I think about today is that all the speakers are members of the Mortimer History Society. And I think that's the first time that at a conference with 5 speakers, all 5 have been members. So it's lovely to welcome Shaun. His research has very much been about the bishops of Bangor in the 12th and 13th centuries. And I suppose it occurred to me during Catherine's talk that if there was a sort of underlying theme to today's talks, it is an element of murder mystery and who killed whom, and indeed, was that person even killed? Now, in terms of Llywelyn, yes, Shaun's looking at me worried. In terms of who killed Llywelyn, then we know that he was killed. We know the circumstances of his death. So it isn't a murder mystery in that sense, but indeed there is mystery in terms of the circumstances that led up to his death and the events that culminated in that event. And Shaun is going to talk to us about the possible involvement of Bishop Anian in the events leading up to the death of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales.
Dr. Barr, thank you. Have you got the... Oh, yeah, thanks. Is it right to go on? Yes, right. Is this working?
Yep.
Yes. Is this working? Yes, great. Good morning. And a very difficult talk to follow. It's a fantastic talk indeed. Thank you to Philip and the Society, and welcome to the new member from the United States. Yeah, this morning I'm going to talk about one of the bishops of Bangor, one of the bishops who was contemporary with Llywelyn the Last, the Prince of Wales. Let's see if the slide works. No? Voila. Yeah. So an intriguing entry appears in the Welsh Chronicle of the Princes, the Brut y Tywysogion, for the year 1282, and then was effected the betrayal of Llywelyn in the Belfry of Bangor by his own men. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd was the grandson of Llywelyn the Great, and he achieved something that his grandfather never did, recognition of his status as Prince of Wales by the King of England, Henry III. However, he was to lose his principality and his life to Henry's implacable son, Edward I. He was killed on the 11th of December, 1282, and there was more than a hint of treachery involved. The Brut y Tywysogion states that the betrayal of Llywelyn was effected by his own men, and historians have speculated as to which men may have been involved. One person who perhaps has been overlooked is the Bishop of Bangor, Anian, who was not only appointed to Llywelyn's council and acted as his envoy, he was also the prince's confessor. Preserved at the National Archives in Kew are original letters written by Anian, which reveal an intense animosity towards Llywelyn in the years and months leading up to the prince's murder. This talk, by examining those letters and other contemporary documents, will consider if the Bishop of Bangor played a part in the downfall of the Prince of Wales. I will also consider what evidence there is to implicate other Welsh churchmen, both secular clergy and those in religious orders. Llywelyn came to prominence shortly after his father died, trying to escape from the Tower of London on St. David's Day, 1244. Gruffudd's death precipitated a war with Henry III. Llywelyn was joined by his older brother, but the king's forces succeeded in reaching the eastern bank of the River Conwy in the spring of 1247. The brothers were forced in the so-called Treaty of Woodstock to cede to the crown Gwynedd East Conwy, that is Gwynedd to the east of the River Conwy, also known as the Four Cantrefs, and agreed to hold Gwynedd Uwch Conwy, that is Gwynedd to the west of the River Conwy, including Eryri, Snowdonia, from the king in return for military service. Llywelyn had already ceded all claim upon the Mortimer lordships in eastern central Wales, an indication perhaps that Ralph Mortimer already recognised the young man's capability and considered it prudent to obtain the release. In 1255, at the Battle of Bryn Derwen, Llywelyn defeated his older brother and a younger brother, Dafydd, consolidating his hold on the heartland of Gwynedd. The following year, he crossed the Conwy and, making the most of the disaffection of the local population with the governance of English officials, annexed the four cantrefs. He then turned southwest and annexed Meirionnydd. Just like his grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, he now controlled all the land from the Dyfi estuary to the Dee. According to the Brut y Tywysogion in 1258, the same year as he entered into an agreement with a group of Scottish nobles, Llywelyn held an assembly of the magnates of Wales who swore an oath of allegiance to him. He also entered into written lord and vassal agreements with Princes of Powys and South and Southwest Wales, with the support of the bishops of Bangor and St. Asaph. In 1260, to coincide with diplomatic initiatives in his quest for a lasting peace treaty with Henry III, Llywelyn attacked the royal castle of Belfry. It was the then Bishop of Bangor, Richard, who did most of the negotiating on Llywelyn's behalf. Henry's court recognizing the bishop's labours in a contemporary enrolment. The custody of the castle had been granted to another grandson of Llywelyn the Great, Roger Mortimer. With the age of siege engines, the castle was taken and razed to the ground. Mortimer was at court in London on the day the castle fell. Llywelyn continued his attacks in the March, with Roger Mortimer's lordships firmly in his sights. 1264, his forces joined with those of Simon de Montfort to attack Mortimer's castle of Radnor. In June of the following year, envoys of de Montfort and Llywelyn met to negotiate an agreement whereby the now captive Henry III granted Llywelyn the lordship of all the Welsh barons and the Principality of Wales. It was not to last, as de Montfort was of course killed at Evesham 2 months later, and Henry was released from captivity by the Lord Edward. In 1267, however, Llywelyn finally achieved the peace treaty for which he had worked so hard. In September of that year, he did homage and fealty to Henry III, possibly at Montgomery Castle, possibly at the nearby ford across the Severn. Henry, in turn, recognised him as Prince of Wales. The king, wishing to magnify the person of Llywelyn and honour his successors, grants by his pure liberality and grace, with the consent of the Lord Edward, to Llywelyn and his heirs the Principality of Wales, so that Llywelyn and his heirs shall be called and shall be princes of Wales. For Llywelyn, this was to be the pinnacle of his achievements. He had succeeded where even his grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, had failed. However, the Treaty of Montgomery was to prove in many ways to be a poisoned chalice. In return for the above-mentioned concession and the grace and goodwill of the king and his sons, the treaty continued. The prince is bound to give the king and his heirs 25,000 marks. After an initial payment, the money was to be paid in fixed instalments of 3,000 marks a year at Christmas. With penalty payments due for each month, the prince was in arrears. It has been estimated that Llywelyn's total annual income may have been as low as 3,750 marks per annum. And as such, the treaty's financial stipulations would have been a heavy burden on his limited resources. Llywelyn paid all the instalments due until Christmas 1270, when only part was paid. Falling further into arrears, he stopped paying altogether on the accession of Edward I in 1272. In total, it seems that he paid 13,750 marks and possibly a further 5,000 marks for the homage of a Lord of the Haybarth being Southwest Wales. And historians, wondering how Llywelyn raised such large sums, have noted that contemporary sources record him turning to novel revenue-raising methods, much to the chagrin of his subjects. Richard, the Bishop of Bangor, who had worked so hard to bring about peace between Henry and Llywelyn, died shortly after the Treaty of Montgomery. On his death, the Bangor Cathedral chapter elected the Archdeacon of Anglesey, Master Anian. It is not known where Anian was educated, nor when he obtained his title of Master, but he was the fourth Master and second Archdeacon to become Bishop. Royal assent to his election was granted in December 1267, and Anian was consecrated shortly thereafter by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Boniface of Savoy. The patent roll records that Henry III restored the temporalities of the bishopric to Anian. To quote, "As custom is, and commands Llywelyn, son of Griffin, Prince of Wales, to let him have seizing thereof, so far as pertains to the said Llywelyn." As all bishops of Bangor had done since 1120, Anian professed canonical obedience and subjection to the Archbishop of Canterbury. His written profession, which he signed, survives. For a time, during the second quarter of the 12th century, and again at the turn of the 13th, St. David's had argued that bishops of Welsh sees owed obedience to it, not Canterbury. But that argument had long since been lost, although it was briefly resurrected during Anian's episcopate by Thomas Beck, but given very short shrift by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham. Anian's diocese, shown here edged in purple, including not only the heartland of the princes of Gwynedd, to the west of the River Conwy, including Anglesey and Meirionydd, but also two detached portions, namely Dyffryn Clwyd and Arwisley. When Anian was elected by the Bangor Cathedral chapter in the autumn, early winter of 1267, Llywelyn was at the height of his powers, and it is difficult to imagine Anian being promoted without the approval of the Prince of Wales. Certainly, soon after his consecration, the new bishop was appointed by Llywelyn to act on his behalf in an arbitration between the Prince and the Marcher Lord Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester. Then Llywelyn sought Anian's episcopal approval and ecclesiastical censure to agreements with his two younger brothers. He had kept his older brother imprisoned after the Battle of Bryn Derwin. Firstly, Dafydd gave Llywelyn his fealty, homage, and service, and secondly, Rhodri quitclaimed all his hereditary claim to lands in the Principality of Wales in return for 1,000 marks. About 10 years later, Llywelyn had only paid 50. So I think that's something to bear in mind when we're talking about how much money he had to meet his treaty obligations. It had now become routine for Llywelyn to employ the bishops of Bangor in his dealings with other Welsh princes. Anian's predecessor, Richard, had been similarly employed. However, Anian was to prove even more useful to the Prince of Wales. In 1274, at Llywelyn's new castle of Dolforwyn, Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn of Powys and his son Owain were tried for conspiracy against Llywelyn. At the trial, it was held that they and their lands were at Llywelyn's mercy. The terms imposed included that Owain was to become Llywelyn's hostage. Anian and the bishops of the three other Welsh sees, Llandaff, St. Asaph, and St. David's, were to pronounce sentences of excommunication for any transgression, and they could act jointly or severally in so doing. Whilst in custody, it was to Anian and certain members of the Bangor chapter that Owain turned to confess the full extent of the conspiracy. The plan, which involved not only the Powisian lords, but also Llywelyn's own brother Dafydd, was that Owain was to have killed Llywelyn in return for the grant of lands and the hand of Dafydd's daughter, Llywelyn's niece, in marriage. This information was passed to the Prince of Wales, who, after Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn had fled to England, confiscated Gruffudd's lands and his castle at Welshpool. Anian was clearly valued by Llywelyn and appointed to his council. The bishop also became the prince's confessor. Further, when war loomed in 1277, it was to Anian that the prince turned. He sent the Bishop of Bangor to the new king, Edward I, with his proposals for peace. However, matters had gone too far. Llywelyn had stopped paying the instalments due pursuant to the Treaty of Montgomery and had failed to attend Edward's coronation or pay homage to the new king when summoned to do so. The prince, for his part, was aggrieved that Edward was harbouring both Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn and David, who had also fled to England in 1274. Further, there had been and continued to be great animosity between Llywelyn and the Marcher lords, particularly Mortimer, the prince complaining that the latter was building a new fortress at Cefn in violation of the treaty. Mortimer, in the king's name, had complained about Llywelyn's castle building at Dolforwyn. Llywelyn's marriage by proxy to the daughter of Simon de Montfort, Eleanor, who was captured on the high seas on her way to Wales in 1275, was also an issue. It has been suggested that Llywelyn arranged the marriage in retaliation for Edward giving refuge to David and Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn. Interestingly, 2 Welsh Dominicans were captured with Eleanor on her way to meet her husband for the first time, including, most probably, the prior of the Dominican friary of Bangor. When handing them over to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward said they were the brains behind the operation. This rings true, as before leaving for Wales, Eleanor had been with her mother at a Dominican nunnery south of Paris, founded by the de Montfort family. On the 10th of February 1277, a convocation at the new temple, attended by the Bishop of St. Asaph, but not the Bishop of Bangor, excommunicated the prince, and military operations were set in train. On Palm Sunday, 1277, Anian finally bent to pressure from the Archbishop of Canterbury and excommunicated the prince, fleeing to England after doing so. He took refuge at St. Albans, from where he wrote to Edward, stating that it was certainly true that he loved the Prince of Wales and his own people, provided that he could do so in good conscience. However, because the prince had offended God and the church in many things, and had endeavoured to withdraw his homage from the king, his liege lord, Anian had publicly excommunicated Llywelyn, candles lit and bells ringing, although few in the realm could have believed this of him, for he had been the prince's confessor. The bishop went on to say that he could not stir a foot except under the prince's power, and he had escaped and come to England for fear of death or at least arrest. Now, the contents of Anian's letter are shocking, and yet there's no indication of the strength of his feelings towards Llywelyn before this time. Although a few years earlier, he had, in conjunction with the Bishop of St. Asaph, reminded Llywelyn to observe his contractual obligations vis-a-vis other Welsh lords. Another interesting aspect of Anian's letter is that he stated he was a most faithful chaplain to the king, which could suggest that Edward was not just recruiting the secular lords of Wales to his cause and his impending invasion of Gwynedd. Defections to Edward included lords of Ceredigion and Deheubarth, who on the same day as Anian fled to England swore fealty to the king. Further, the Dominican prior of Bangor, he who had, according to Edward, endeavoured to bring Eleanor de Montfort to Gwynedd, also defected to the king, thanks to the intercession of none other than Roger Mortimer. The War of 1277 was a crushing defeat for Llywelyn. On the 9th of November, pursuant to the Treaty of Aberconwy, he undertook to pay the substantial sum of £50,000 to secure the king's grace and mercy. Further, he was obliged to cede the four cantrevs to Edward and pay 1,000 marks a year for Anglesey. Whilst keeping the title Prince of Wales, he was only allowed the homages of 5 fairly minor Welsh lords, and these only for his lifetime. The other Welsh homages fell to the king. The following day, Llywelyn, having been assured of safe conduct, crossed the Conwy and made his way to Rhuddlan to swear fealty to the king. Having excommunicated the prince and fled to England on Palm Sunday, fearing death or at least arrest, Anian may have only felt confident in returning to Gwynedd ap Conwy once Llywelyn had submitted to Edward. From his episcopal manor at Treffos on Anglesey, Anian wrote to his friend and fellow bishop, Edward's chancellor, the powerful and influential Robert Burnell, relating how, when he was with the chancellor in the English camp at Rhuddlan, he had lost his brother, his sister's son, his cousin, and kinsman to the number of 60 in the king's service, and that Llywelyn greatly rejoiced at his misfortune. Anian also lamented the burning of churches. It was Robert Burnell who had accompanied the Prince of Wales to swear fealty to the king, and it was no doubt he who organised the grant to Anian of wardships in England to the value of £20 yearly on receiving the Bishop of Bangor's letter, shown here. Once Anian was back in Bangor, he wrote to Robert Burnell again. In this letter, in which he described the Chancellor as protector and defender of the poor and oppressed, he stated that he was enclosing articles detailing Llywelyn's offences against the church and asked that they be brought to the king's attention, so that, in Anian's words, the church might be defended against the tyrannical prince and his malevolent and satanic ministers. The letter was most probably written at the start of 1278, for shortly afterwards the king rebuked Llywelyn, demanding that he acted in a way as regards the spiritual rights and temporalities of the Bishop of Bangor that befitted a prince. In the same year, the king enlisted Anian to act for him in a dispute on Anglesey concerning William Burnell, a relative of the Chancellor. Anian's list of grievances have not survived, but his litigious namesake at St. Asaph had already produced a list. In 1274, a synod of canons, clerics, and laymen of the Diocese of St. Asaph, summoned by the bishop, issued a document listing grievances concerning the prince, which were added to and elaborated upon by a second synod held in 1276. The items complained of included that Llywelyn infringed the jurisdiction of the bishop's courts and seized the goods of episcopal tenants who had died intestate, a matter which the Bishop of Bangor was also to complain about. Further, Anian St. Asaph wrote to the Pope eliciting a papal warning to Llywelyn that the prince ought to take no action contrary to the liberties of the church. Llywelyn's response was to issue a charter in which he made a number of important concessions. As he was at the time seeking the Pope's help in endeavouring to have his wife, Eleanor de Montfort, released from captivity, the prince's concessions were perhaps more aimed at mollifying the Pope than appeasing the bishop. Be that as it may, the Brut y Tywysogion described Bishop Anian of St. Asaph as a man who was the strongest in maintaining his diocese that anyone saw. It was he who released Llywelyn from excommunication in November 1277, not Anian of Bangor, who had so publicly announced the sentence. By April 1279, Anian of Bangor was once again absent from his diocese. For that month, he was in faraway Suffolk, where he dedicated a cemetery for the Austin friars at Clare and granted 2 indulgences. Clare was a foremost house of the order in England, founded by Gilbert de Clare's father, Gilbert, the Earl of Gloucester, who had been thanked by Edward for his immense labours and expenses in the king's campaign against Llywelyn in 1277, was to marry Edward's daughter, Joan of Acre. who became a major benefactor of the Austin Friars in Suffolk, choosing to be buried there. Whether Anian's presence at Clare demonstrates an affinity for the Earl of Gloucester, or just an example of a Bishop of Bangor performing episcopal tasks whilst in exile, is unclear. In the August of 1279, Anian was in Reading with Archbishop Peckham, to whom he complained about Llywelyn's usurpation of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. In July of the following year, Edward I granted him a house in Shoe Lane, Holborn, and in October 1280, he was with the king in Lincoln when the new Bishop of St. David's, Thomas Beck, was consecrated. He took the opportunity to ask for timber, presumably for building works in Holborn. For later the same month, Edward instructed the Constable of Windsor to let the Bishop of Bangor have 6 oaks suitable for timber from the raw forest by the king's gift. War broke out again in the spring of 1282, and Edward swiftly sought ecclesiastical support, calling upon the archbishops to excommunicate the rebels. In Gwynedd, Anian, following instructions issued by Archbishop Peckham, pronounced another sentence of excommunication. In a further letter to Robert Burnell, in which he complained that Llywelyn was encouraging his adversaries, certain incestuous adulterers of his own chapter, to impugn him, Anian stated that he was not able to live peacefully in the land of the prince. The letter, as you can see, is damaged, but it seems that he may have been seeking refuge, and refuge in Cheshire at that. You can see Anian's got a way with words to get his own way. I think at this point it's worth mentioning a very interesting charter granted during Anian's episcopate and recorded in the Cartulae of the Augustinians of Horman Priory in Shropshire. The dean and chapter of Bangor were asked by Horman, for presumably they only acted on the abbey's request, to confirm the charters of the bishops of Bangor in favour of the abbey concerning certain churches in Arwisley and Gwynedd. Not only did the dean and chapter confirm the charters of 5 previous bishops, they also confirmed Anian's own very recent charter of 1272, a charter in which he had already confirmed the grants of his 5 predecessors. Why would the canons of Hormond seek further confirmation whilst Anian was very much alive and very much Bishop of Bangor? Perhaps the uncertainty of one or both of the 2 Welsh wars, coupled with Anian's recurring exile from his see, prompted the canons of Hormond to seek confirmation from the dean and chapter. It could suggest that the canons feared that Anian would not return to his bishopric, or that he was no longer the power in his diocese that he had been in 1272. In this regard, it is noteworthy that, as we have seen in 1277, Anian stated that he had fled to England for fear of death or at least arrest. And in 1281 too, he complained that he was not able to live peacefully in the land of the prince. The canons' actions may even suggest that they thought Anian was dead. As the dean and chapter acquiesced, they too may have shared some of Hormond's concerns, or alternatively, been partially responsible for Anian's flight. Whatever the concerns of Hormond, Anian seems to be more than capable of looking after himself, for in July 1282, there's further evidence of his interaction with Edward and those closest to the king. Once again, the Bishop of Bangor is to be found with the king's forces at Rhuddlan. There he witnessed Edward's grant of land to a loyal Welsh lord. Other witnesses included Robert Burnell, Otto de Grandison, and Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln. De Lacy was in constant royal service, proving to be a trusted servant and friend to Edward. He had led a contingent of cavalry in the War of 1277, and along with Robert Burnell, had accompanied Llywelyn when the prince went to the king to swear fealty, after the Treaty of Aberconwy. We have the record of an indulgence Anian granted at about this time in favour of the Cistercian Abbey of Stanlaw on the Wirral, a house founded by Henry de Lacy's family. The Earl of Lincoln's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all buried there, and it is highly likely that Henry de Lacy procured the indulgence when he was in the Bishop of Bangor's company. Whilst Robert Burnell was Anian's main point of contact in the administration of Edward I, the Bishop of Bangor would on occasion write to other members of the King's Council, including John Kirkby, the future Bishop of Ely, who was Vice-Chancellor in all but name. When Burnell was absent, it was Kirkby who had custody of the Great Seal. He is greatly indebted to the venerable and beloved Lord John Kirkby, Councillor of the King, wrote Anian. Thanks to his help, the bishop's business in England has been straightened out, and he now prays that Kirkby instruct the clerks and barons of the Exchequer at Shrewsbury not to detain the money which the bishop ought to have from his warships in Devon and Dorset, because his clerks and nephews are perishing for lack of money. On another occasion, when the king was in Gascony, Anian wrote to the regent, Edmund, Earl of Cornwall, to ensure that the rights of his diocese were upheld. And he made it clear he was not just Anian by divine permission, the humble minister of the Church of Bangor, he was indeed the king's chaplain in Wales. Immediately before the enigmatic sentence in the Brut y Tywysogion about the betrayal in the Belfry is an entry concerning the construction of boats across the Menai Straits from Anglesey. In the first week of November 1282, Archbishop Peckham travelled to Gwynethrup Conwy to parley with Llywelyn. Whilst he was there or shortly after he had returned to the king, the English forces on Anglesey constructed a bridge of boats and attempted a crossing to the mainland, perhaps close to Bangor itself. According to both English and Welsh chroniclers, the crossing was a disaster for the English, the Brits stating that the bridge broke and many English troops were drowned or slain. Amongst those who perished were two nephews, possibly sons of the Chancellor Robert Burnell, one of whom, William, was certainly known to Anian. Otto de Grandison, who had been at Rhuddlan with the Bishop of Bangor in July, narrowly escaped with his life. Howell, the brother of the Dominican friar of Bangor, who had also defected to the English, was not so lucky. His name is included in a list of the dead in the Chester Chronicle, the Chronicle of St. Werburgh. And here's a nice advert for the School of Ocean Sciences. So Llywelyn was killed on the 11th of December, 1282 near Bilth. His head was cut off and sent to the king at Rhuddlan, then to London, where it was mounted on an iron spike at the Tower. Now, the English chroniclers differ as to how the Prince of Wales met his end. Some have the men of Roger Lestrange striking the fatal blow, and it was his letter that informed Edward that Llywelyn and the flower of his army were dead. But the Brut y Tywysogion blames Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn of Powys, he who had conspired to kill Llywelyn in 1274, and Roger Mortimer the younger. Roger Mortimer the elder had died 2 weeks earlier. Immediately after the entry about the betrayal in the Belfry, the Brut y Tywysogion records that Llywelyn, leaving his brother Dafydd to guard Gwynedd, took his army to gain possession of Powys and Bilth. And he sent his men and a steward to receive the homage of the men of Brycheiniog. He was left, the Welsh Chronicle says, with but a few men, when Roger Mortimer and Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn, and with them the king's host, came upon them without warning. Certain English chronicles also state that Llywelyn was with only a few men when he was ambushed. And the elegy of one Welsh poet lamented the killing of the 18, possibly or presumably Llywelyn's tailie or bodyguard. Roger Mortimer the younger is also implicated by the Hagnamy Chronicle. He is said to have sent word to Llywelyn to come to receive his homage. The prince had entered into an agreement with Roger Mortimer Sr. in October 1281. And after the death of the powerful Marcher Lord, it is conceivable that Llywelyn believed that this was to be renewed with his son. The Mortimer connection is further strengthened by the fact that, according to the Archbishop of Canterbury, another member of the family, Edmund, was after the battle in possession of the prince's privy seal. and a treasonable letter disguised by false names. The Dunstable analyst alleged that Edmund had feigned friendship with the prince and treachery to the king to draw Llywelyn to his death. The archbishop, concerned that the contents of the letter might prove discomforting to certain men, passed the details of the same to Robert Burnell and trusted the king that no one should be troubled on account of it. The actions of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, warrant further consideration. Despite his apparent attempts to forge a peace, he had a jaundiced view of the Welsh, subscribing to the view that they were barbaric, uncivilized, and addicted to prophecy, and would benefit from integration into English rule. He had informed Llywelyn that Welsh law, the law of Hywel Dda, was at variance with several articles of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Nor was he particularly impressed by the secular clergy of Wales. He ordered the bishops of Bangor and St. Asaph to enforce the wearing of the usual clerical dress in their diocese. I have no idea what they were wearing before he issued that edict, and also observe legatine statutes against married priests. When Peckham left Gwynedd in November 1282, after treating with Llywelyn in vain, he left behind a Dominican friar, Adam of Nannau, who was required to fulfill certain duties with regard to Llywelyn and the magnates of the land for the benefit of the state, in inverted commas. What these duties were, we do not know, but ominously, on the very day the Prince of Wales was killed, Peckham ordered Brother Adam to return to the Archbishop without delay. Interestingly, some years later, Bishop Anian of St. Asaph named Brother Adam as an executor of his will and bequeathed him his Bible. Now, this could, of course, suggest no more than that they came from the same township and were the same order, but it could suggest that they were more closely connected. As we've seen, another Dominican, the Welsh Prior of Bangor, had defected to the king in 1277, thanks to the efforts of Roger Mortimer Sr. And the prior had lost his brother during the failed English attempt to cross the Menai in November 1282. It is perhaps worth noting that after the war, Anian granted the Dominican friary an acre of land in Bangor. Whatever the deeds of Brother Adam and the prior of Bangor, there were certainly contemporary accusations levelled against other Welsh churchmen. A cleric of Llanfaes on Anglesey was accused of bearing arms and killing men and betraying Llywelyn's brother, David, who was captured in June 1283 by men of his own tongue. And we must not leave out Master Iorwerth, a canon of Bangor Cathedral, who had also been Llywelyn's vice-chancellor and had been the prince's co-envoy with Bishop Anian in the lead up to the war in 1277. He seems to be the same Master Iorwerth who became a clerk of the king and was granted a royal pension of 10 shillings a year. However, Anian's comment about his adversaries, certain incestuous adulterers of his own chapter, being encouraged by Llywelyn to impugn him, suggests that the Church of Bangor was divided in its loyalties, and there's contemporary evidence of cathedral canons remaining loyal to the Prince of Wales. One such canon, it seems, was Madog Fychan, who in peacetime had acted as a clerk for Llywelyn. In the war 1282-3, he was said to have pulled a knight from his horse, killing them both. In the 1291 taxation and the 1306 extended lands of the Bishop of Bangor, both the cleric from Llanfaes and Madog Fychan are still in post. So I wonder what action was taken about them. But they certainly survived, and they seem to be doing very nicely in 1291 and 1306 respectively. Oh, Philip, I might need your assistance. Not quite sure what I've done there. Just trying to get the next slide. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. The magic touch. Thanks. The allegiance of one other member of the Bangor Church is worth considering, and that is the Archdeacon of Anglesey, Madoc ap Cynrig, who was well favoured following the demise of Llywelyn. In 1283, he and the Dominican prior of Bangor were engaged in making extents for the crown. And in 1284, Edward I granted Archdeacon Madoc the benefice in Wales, called in Welsh a furiad teulu, i.e. priest of the royal household, a lucrative office that had been used by the native princes as a form of patronage, and having a special relationship with the ruler's military household, his teulu, bodyguard or warband, whom the priest served. According to the Welsh laws of Gwynedd, the priest was entitled to food, drink, clothes, a horse, as well as a percentage of tithes. One of his privileges was to be rector of all the prince's chapels. There were secretarial responsibilities, for which he was paid 4 pence for every open seal, probably a reference to a charter or letter patent. But one of his duties was not to be drunk. So they'd take away his horse. I'm not sure if that's true. Interestingly, a 14th century source refers to the Bishop of Bangor as Anian ap Cynrig. In other words, Madoc, the Archdeacon of Anglesey, who was favoured by Edward after Llywelyn's death, may have been a relative of Anian's. Indeed, he may have been Anian's brother. After the death of Llywelyn and the capture of Dafydd, it was the officers of Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, who secured bonds from upright men of the cantrevs immediately east of the Conway to keep the peace. But it was to Bishop Anian of Bangor that the Crown looked to secure bonds from 6 cantrevs in the former Heartland and the Princes of Gwynedd, by which the more upright and trustworthy men of the respective communities bound themselves under ecclesiastical censure to ensure that the peace was kept. And further, it was the Bishop of Bangor who was entrusted shortly thereafter with hearing the grievances of those same communities against Llywelyn, a list of gravamina being drawn up in the bishop's presence. The list included not only items that had previously arisen in disputes with the prince and the bishops of Bangor and St. Asaph, but also complaints about the laity. But also complaints to the laity about seizure of land and novel taxation, the latter being accompanied by an increase in the number of officials to administer and collect the taxes imposed, perhaps a manifestation of Llywelyn's need to raise extra revenue to comply with his treaty obligations. Anian's loyalty to Edward was well rewarded, besides the house in Holborn and compensation for war damages. He was granted lands, manors, and wardships in England, and a proportion of the tithes on royal estates and other properties in North East Wales, and the right to make a will. One antiquarian writer records that when Edward's queen, Eleanor of Castile, gave birth to a baby boy in April 1284 at Caernarvon Castle, it was Bishop Anian of Bangor who christened the future Edward II, and was rewarded with more land, manors, and interestingly ferries. He got 2 ferries for that, according to the, which are very lucrative, according to the antiquarian writer in 1721. So, in conclusion, Anian, a Welshman promoted from the local diocese, seems to have been politically astute, certainly enough to change his secular allegiance when it was prudent to do so. He came to know many of the major figures in Edward's administration, both civilian and military, and seems to have been trusted by the king himself. In trying times, he utilized his connections for the betterment of his diocese and himself. Over several years, he enlisted the assistance of his friend, fellow bishop and Edward I's Chancellor, Robert Burnell, in his disputes with Llywelyn and in seeking refuge in time of war. We have seen that Bernel lost 2 nephews, possibly sons, during the failed attempt to cross the Menai. And Anian certainly knew one of them, and that Otto de Grandison narrowly escaped with his life. The Bishop of Bangor was with Grandison in July 1282. And he knew 2 of Edward's other military leaders, Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, and Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester. Anian also enlisted the help of Archbishop Peckham, who wrote to the Prince of Wales on the Bishop of Bangor's behalf, condemning the usurpation of episcopal rights and jurisdiction. The Archbishop did not have a very high opinion of the Welsh or their laws and criticised their clergy, but he did leave behind a Welsh Dominican friar at a crucial stage in the War of 1282 to, as he put it, fulfill certain benefits, fulfill certain duties for the benefit of the state. Through his allegiance to the king, to whom he was chaplain in Wales, Anian saw his diocese temporalities greatly enhanced. House in London, lands and manors, wardships in England, portion of tithes and royal estates, compensation for royal damage, etc. It was to him that the English authorities turned to secure the peace in the former heartland of the Princes of Gwynedd, after the defeat of Llywelyn and Dafydd and the end of native Welsh rule. And it was perhaps to him that Edward turned to have his son, the first English Prince of Wales, christened. Now, it might be unfair to suggest that Anian had anything to do with Llywelyn's death, and I can find no connection between the Bishop of Bangor and Roger Lestrange and the Mortimers, the English commanders in the field on the day Llywelyn was killed. There are certainly many unanswered questions, and Anian's extant letters in this talk perhaps raise even more. However, if the Bishop of Bangor was indeed the brother of Madog ap Cynrig, the Archdeacon of Anglesey, who was well rewarded in the immediate aftermath of Llywelyn's death, the English had in their camp at Rhuddlan someone who might act as a conduit to those Welsh speakers plotting against Llywelyn in the Belfry, including possibly one canon of Anian's own cathedral. Other secular clergy in his diocese were also accused at the time. Further, there's no love lost between the Bishop of St. Asaph and Llywelyn, and the 2 North Walian bishops had had cause to issue a joint reprimand to the prince some years earlier. The role of the Dominican prior of Bangor has also been noted. After having been Llywelyn's confessor and trusted envoy, as well as a member of the Prince's Council, the death of so many of Anian's relatives in the preceding war 1277, at which Llywelyn supposedly rejoiced, the fear Anian expressed for his own life, his periods of exile combined with having to deal with, as he put it, a tyrannical prince and his malevolent and satanic ministers, as well as the knowledge that certain members of his own chapter had been encouraged to impugn him, may have given him all the incentive he needed to exact revenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. Just sort of going back to the murder mystery theme, then yes, if the sort of sword in the garden, rather than the study, the sword in the garden was wielded by Lestrange. I think you've certainly shown the complicity of Anian, Bishop of Bangor, or the scope for his complicity in the events that led up to the death of Llywelyn. It is now exactly 12 o'clock. I am conscious that some people have got tables booked